us this very handsome little tome called Our Block, How We Win. He's former Director of Strategic Communications for Labour under Jeremy Corbyn and co-founder of the campaign group Momentum. The number to call, 0345 6060 973. You can text 84850. You can ask Alexa to send a message to send a comment to LBC. One day I'll get that right. And you can watch us on Global Player.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Right, let's go to our first caller. It's Chris in Cowbridge in South Wales. Hello, Chris.
Good evening, Ian. Thanks for having me on.
Hi.
I'll ask my first question. Good evening, panel. After today's PMQs, do the panel consider it's important for the public to hear direct answers to straight questions?
Peter Hitchens.
Of course, but you would be very unwise to expect that at Prime Minister's questions. That's not what it's for. It's a performance in which people pretend to be clashing with the opposition when they're not actually doing so, and questions are asked which are not expected to be answered. If you want to have that sort of thing, then you need a better parliament, and you need a parliament which is much more genuinely adversarial than the one we have at the moment. Those political parties which shout and howl at each other during Prime Minister's questions actually don't disagree with each other about anything much, or have anything very important to ask each other. And if you want that to change, as I say, then the best thing to do is to withdraw the support which far too many voters have for the dead corpse parties which have been there for far too long and don't really represent anybody except a metropolitan elite, and start having two proper parties which genuinely oppose each other and which would have real question to ask each other. But the Parliament as it is staged. I remember when the Prime Minister's questions, which used to take place when I was in the parliamentary lobby between Margaret Thatcher and Neil Kinnock, there was genuine tension between them because they really did disagree profoundly about the way in which the country should be governed, and that made an enormous difference. But all that's gone now.
Has it really?
I think so.
I mean, when Jeremy Corbyn was leader of the Labour Party and Boris Johnson was Prime Minister, there were genuine differences there. I would say today there were genuine differences.
I'm not sure what the general differences are now. I think there's something in what you say about Jeremy Corbyn, because for once a left-wing party had an actual left-wing leader, which I always thought wasn't such a bad idea. But Johnson isn't particularly conservative, so there wasn't an enormous clash between them. I think that it would be hard to make out really, really fundamental basic differences between him, even in Corbyn's Labour Party.
Well, James, you were there. What was it like preparing Jeremy Corbyn for Prime Minister's questions? Did you feel that there were those genuine policy differences, and did you ever think you were going to get an answer from Boris Johnson?
There were huge policy differences between Jeremy and David Cameron, Jeremy and Theresa May, Jeremy and Boris Johnson. I mean, I agree with Peter's main point about Parliament being a bit of a show and quite theatrical, and a lot of it not being very worthwhile. I tried to not get too involved with Prime Minister's question time and just look at the bit that we'd put out for a clip on social media, because more people would see that, because the actual cut and thrust of it was, is very staged, and it's almost impossible to get a straight answer out of Boris Johnson. He's extremely good at obfuscating and bluster.
What did you make today of Rishi Sunak? Because a lot of people on social media were saying, well, it may have been a bit of a showman performance by Rishi Sunak, but he was just trotting out Boris Johnson's old mantras.
Well, I mean, that's probably what his side wants. They want that. They want someone that will go with the election-winning formula, so as they see it from 2019, but who's something of a clean skin. I must admit, I didn't watch all of it, but he seemed quite sort of confident and energetic, which passes for success, rather than, as Peter's saying, actually answering lots of questions. Although he did make the point about fracking, which I think is a genuine shift, not from Labour, but from Liz Truss.
Joe Gideon, were you there today?
I was there today, yes.
I mean, it is theatre, isn't it? And I always thought, I remember when William Hague was asking Tony Blair questions, that was the only point in the political week where Conservatives generally felt positive, because William Hague often bested Tony Blair. So there is a point to it, even if it isn't answering questions as Chris would like them to do. How did you assess today?
Yes, I mean, there is a point to it, and certainly today was a massive morale booster. I think, both sides clearly, you said earlier about each each side having their own worldview and therefore thinking that they'd perform better than the other side. I think for the Conservatives, it was massively important for us all to come together, all the different factions that we've had over the last few months, and to be able to get behind the Prime Minister. And for that point, it was a success. But to go back to the point about the theatre and whether it's worth having politicians anymore, because they don't really disagree. Most of the work we do is really boring behind closed doors, is really important. We sit on various committees. Some of them are televised. Most people wouldn't bother watching them because actually, they're not showbiz. They're really, you will take days and days and days talking about bill committees. That's not entertainment, but it's really important work.
Peter York.
Well, I think Chris is entitled to get an answer to a question because that's, I think, clearly what he wants. But it's the first thing they teach you when you're a proper Pole, not a virgin, is how not to answer questions, how to swerve, how to duck, all that sort of thing. They teach you...
Do you not think it comes naturally?
I think no, I don't think it comes
to the best of them it does. To the best of them it does. They know from birth.
Really clever people have been doing it for a long time. But as for the rest of Poles, no, it doesn't come naturally. They have people of the Linton Crosby variety to tell them how to do this.
I mean, when I was in politics, I have to say I never got any lessons in how to do that. Did you, Jo?
I never did, no.
So we're going to get straight questions from you all evening.
Absolutely.
Excellent.
Wait till you're Prime Minister.
None of you is in the Cabinet.
Wait till you're Prime Minister. Wait till you're doing that stuff. You'll get those lessons.
But it is partly about theatre, isn't it? And always has been. But I remember Liz Truss's first PMQs where she and Keir Starmer got a lot of praise because they did actually have a bit of a genuine debate with each other. I can't remember what it was about now, but it was meaty for Prime Minister's questions, so it can happen.
Well, presumably Keir Starmer took the view that the longer Liz Truss remained leader of the Conservative Party, the better it would be for him, so the last thing he would do is land any serious blows on her.
Such a cynic.
No, after some of the other things have been said here tonight, that's positively sentimental.
Because that was crucial in how people thought about her. She was so openly, nakedly doing the stuff and thinking, what am I supposed to do here? And how do I swerve this? That nice man that told me how to do it, but I can't quite remember how to do it and everybody picked up on the utter woodenness of her swerves.
That's an interesting point. I mean, slightly going off the theme here, Jo, but when were you first elected?
2019.
And who did you vote for in that contest? Was she or...
So
in the first leadership contest?
In the first leadership contest. So I was Team Rishi. I was actually Team Tom originally.
Right.
And then I moved to Team Rishi.
What I've never understood is why, when a lot of MPs had worked with Liz Truss for 10 years or so, they knew that she was wooden, they knew that she was not a good communicator, and yet they still put her into the final two for the members. Now, I don't blame the members because they didn't know her like MPs did. But, I mean, you all saw her in action.
Well, yes, you'd have to ask some of my colleagues.
Iain, the reason why Liz Truss was Prime Minister for less than 50 days is not because she was a wooden performer or not very good at answering questions. It's because she had policies which she brought forward which were a disaster and tanked the economy, threatened people's pensions and people's mortgages. I mean, she could have been the best performer in the world. It wouldn't have made a difference. If you're putting the cost for people up hundreds of pounds a month, you're going to be in trouble.
Hang on. Gordon Brown raped the pensions of hundreds of thousands of people and became Prime Minister afterwards. Nothing happened to him. You can be terrible Prime Minister doing awful things to people and nothing happens to you. Her woodenness had a huge role in...
I mean, if she'd laid the ground for those policies in that budget, I'm not saying that it would necessarily have changed things, but at least it might have helped not spook the markets quite as much as they were spooked.
Yeah, although she did say over the summer, I'm going to do these things, and to Sunak's credit, actually, he said, don't do that, that will crash the markets, and then she did it, and it crashed the markets. I mean, the bit that was the rabbit in the hat, the 45p rate, is not it's not an enormous amount of money relative to the total extra borrowing to fund tax cuts. It was like 2.5 billion or something like that. So I don't think it's just the pure shock of it. It's just she didn't have a plan for growth. She said she had a plan for growth. She did tax cuts borrowed for them, gave money to bankers, which was unnecessary, and the markets didn't like it, the public didn't like it. That's why she's went. Her woodenness didn't help, but I mean, the fundamental reason is that.
Phil in Nottingham has got... Thanks, Chris, by the way, for your question. Phil in Nottingham has got a text question. Has Rishi Sunak this week successfully reshuffled the deck chairs on the Titanic? Interesting way of phrasing the question. Peter York.
Well, I'm not sure there's that much shuffling being done. The one bit of obvious... I mean, there's a wonderful Daily Mail thing today which shows who's gone and who's there. But in terms of the great offices of state, there hasn't been that much change. And in fact, the Great Restoration, Ms. Braverman, is putting back, that fourth great office of state. It's really important. As for the rest, we're talking about moving around people who nobody had ever heard of in the first place. So in that sense, it doesn't matter. No doubt, at a level which I wouldn't understand, concessions to certain bits of the party, maybe it worked. But in terms of the great offices, it didn't. And in terms of people saying, now we've restored the broad churchiness, the broad churchiness evaporated or was kicked out by Boris at quite a while ago. It's been done. Do you know that sort of one nation?
And as I understand it,
there aren't any left.
The reshuffle that's continuing tonight of the junior ministerial posts, it's a complete cull of Liz Truss supporters. We're probably going to hear a bit more about that later on. James.
Well, in that people's living standards are getting worse and Sunak's going to be Prime Minister for 2 years, it's probably going to be the worst 2 years for people's pay, for people's cost of living. And there isn't going to be this miraculous growth that they're promising, so he's going to make choices of either taxing rich people or cutting things.
What about the reshuffle? That's the question.
Well, I mean, the reshuffle's been made, but what matters is not necessarily who he's got on the pitch, it's what game they're playing. And they're playing in difficult circumstances because the cost of living crisis, which they have substantially contributed to, is a real problem. And they're very unlikely to bring forward the policies which are going to put money in people's pockets, because to do so, you're going to have to tax wealth, which is not something that the Conservative Party is ever really going to do.
Joe, how do you view the reshuffle?
So I think it was very important for us to have the legitimacy which we had at the 2019 election, and Rishi's promise to deliver on the manifesto meant that it's right that he brought a lot of people back and had that broad selection of ministers that aligned to different parts of the party, but very much brought the experience that could deliver on the things that we said in the 2019 manifesto, because that's what we've got to do.
And bringing back Suella Braverman, what do you think of that appointment?
Well, so Suella was obviously a candidate from a wing of the party that it needs to be incorporated, and I understand that the key thing for Rishi, which he promised everybody, was that we would work together and all wings of the party.
So there was no one else from that wing of the party that hadn't been sacked as a cabinet minister for leaking security information 6 days previously. So that's what's called a killer question.
I'm so glad I'm a backbench. I don't have to answer that.
Oh, but you promised you were going to get straight answers earlier.
Well, I can try if you like.
Go on. We're eagerly anticipating.
So
that's not fair.
Oh, Peter.
Thank you. Peter to the rescue.
Who'd have thought? No, come on, I want an answer. I think look, the cards on table. I think it is outrageous that she should be brought back after 6 days. There used to be an unspoken rule, Margaret Thatcher certainly had this, that if you resigned for some sort of scandalous reason, you didn't come back until after you'd fought another election, so you had the validation of the voters. That rule has clearly gone out the window. Don't you think that's bad?
Well, I think Margaret Thatcher was in a different era, and we didn't have quite such short periods between governments.
That's very true.
But I mean, to your point about Suella, she made a mistake. She resigned as a result of that. Under a new Prime Minister, it's his decision as to whether he considers that a serious enough mistake not to bring her back.
Do you?
I mean, I genuinely don't have a view on it, because my understanding of sort of ministerial hiccups is probably too little as somebody who's quite new in the parliamentary career.
Well, by the end of this programme, you might have got a job in the reshuffle. You never know. You better acquaint yourself with the ministerial code.
The announcement may be on its way as soon as you turn your phone again.
Peter, the reshuffle.
Well, it reminds me of the great story about the playwright Tom Stoppard, who was a journalist before he was a playwright, and went for an interview for, I think, the London Evening Standard for a not a particularly political job, and they asked him in the interview, what is the name of the current Home Secretary? Because it says here in your CV that you're interested in politics. And he said, I was interested in politics, not obsessed with it. Most people couldn't care less even who the Home Secretary is, let alone who the Minister of State for Breeze Blocks and Aluminium Cladding is. They don't care, and it makes no impact on them at all. What they do care about, especially at the moment, is the catastrophic state of the economy, particularly the inflation, which is biting everybody so hard at the moment, and they will blame the government for it, and they can't get out of it. I don't think the sort of Canadian-style meltdown that some people speak of is going to happen, but I think the chances of the Conservative Party winning another majority are zero. The question is whether they will be replaced by some sort of coalition between Labour and the SNP and the Liberal Democrats, or whether it will be an actual Labour government. I have to say that the mathematics probably suggest that Labour can't make it. So after that...
What with a 30-point lead at the moment?
Well, but you know that these are squeezed by actual election campaigns down to much narrower margins than that, and Starmer is, if exposed to an awful lot of scrutiny, will not come out particularly well. I mean, he's far to the left of Jeremy Corbyn for a start.
What?
Starmer is a Pabloite.
Sorry, James is nearly fallen off his chair.
No, I know, but this is the problem. They don't understand. Only ex-Marxists understand politics. Starmer, because we know what all the code was. Starmer is a fantastic left-wing person and doesn't deny it. I mean, I write this all the time. I never get any calls from us saying, "How dare you say this?" or threats, because it's true. He has an immensely left-wing record. He gave an interview to the New Statesman a couple of years ago, in which he said, "Yes, I haven't really shifted for any of that." But it simply doesn't get across because of this ridiculous idea that he's a moderate.
Well, it doesn't get across because of everything that he says and does, which is not terribly left-wing, I think.
Well, it depends on what you mean by left-wing.
Well,
but again, are you an
ex-Marxist?
I don't think.
I don't think he's I'm not going to put words into it. We'll talk about his book in a moment. Right, we're going to take some more questions in a moment. If you'd like to contribute to our discussion and ask a question of our panel, 0345 6060 973. It's 8:20.
This is LBC. terms. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Text 84850.
24 minutes past 8. Joe Gideon, Conservative MP, is with us. James Schneider, formerly the founder of Momentum. Peter Hitchens, columnist for the Mail on Sunday. And Peter York, the social commentator. Right, next question is from John in Wallington. Hello, John.
Evening, Ian. Evening, panel.
Evening.
My question is, given that Putin has weaponised energy, is it irresponsible to ban fracking in terms of our national security?
Well, the government announced today they've U-turned on the U-turn, and they are now going to reimpose the ban on fracking, which was in their 2019 manifesto. James Schneider, I think this is a really interesting issue, and it's one that I'm never quite sure which side to come down on. We did an hour on it the other night, had two experts, one anti, one pro-fracking, and I think we learned a lot from that. But where do you stand on this? Because the point from the questioner is that, well, is it irresponsible to ban fracking given our energy needs?
I'm opposed to fracking. Excuse me. I'm opposed to fracking because local communities where there are fracking sites don't want it. They don't want earthquakes. They don't want water that can catch on fire. There's no democratic mandate for it because all the parties that ran in the last election ran on banning it. The climate change is getting pretty much out of control, and we can't afford any new oil and gas, let alone fracking. So for all of those reasons, bringing back in the ban is a good thing. Now, if we want to have a responsible energy policy, then yes, of course, we need to invest in new energy, and we should be looking at renewable energy as much as we possibly can, solar and wind in particular, because we are going to have to not have oil and gas as our main source of energy.
But isn't it wise to have a basket of energy supplies from all sorts of...
We are going to have a basket of energy supplies anyway because we're making a transition. There's an argument that you need a baseline, something that's stable. So wind and solar comes hot, blows hot and cold, as it were. So you've got things like nuclear, which form a stable base. But we don't need fracking. Fracking is dangerous. There's no mandate for it. Nobody wants it, either particularly in the country or in the areas that we're actually going to be affected by it.
Joe?
Well, so I'm agnostic on fracking personally, but it was in our manifesto in 2019 that there would be a moratorium on it, and therefore I think Prime Minister was quite right to go back to that and say we will reinstate it. In terms of energy supply, I agree that we have to look at a broad range of alternative energy sources. I'm particularly interested in geothermal and mine water heating because that's what we can do in Stoke-on-Trent. And I think tidal, there are some interesting additions to solar and onshore and offshore wind. So we already have quite a large number of options. And if fracking is so contentious, I think it's fine to until the evidence shows otherwise to have that moratorium.
Peter?
I don't think that fracking is particularly appealing in this country and our landscape. I'm very worried about what it does to water. I think that a lot of the people who call for it to be made widespread here are basing their ideas on what's happened in the United States, a totally different landscape with far, far more space. I'm not at all sure it would be the answer to our questions about energy. It's true that Putin has weaponized energy, but I was looking up the other day my own writings about this, and I suggested in 2008 that he was going to do so. What I've also been pointing out for a long time is how very dangerous it's been for us to pursue this fanatical net zero policy, which has meant that we've not actually just closed down a large number of coal-fired power stations, which would be fantastically useful this winter if we still had them. We've blown them up to make it irreversible. At the same time, of course, as China is building a nuclear power station about every 5 minutes, so whatever difference it may or may not have made to the to climate change is completely cancelled out by China's activity. I think our energy policy in this country has been lackadaisical, lacking forethought, and in fact positively stupid for many, many years. We've also over so long neglected the obvious course of rebuilding the nuclear power generation, which we ought to have, and making sure that we had that reserve as well. I think we're in very, very deep trouble, but I don't think fracking will solve it.
I mean, I'm getting the impression that you're completely against the net 50 targets. Does that mean that you don't really buy into the objective of reducing?
Well, I'm not going to talk about that because it's pointless. You're not dealing with reason when you try to discuss it. So I don't bother. I simply address it on its own terms, given what the Chinese and the Indians are doing with coal-fired power. It has been ridiculous for us to destroy our coal-fired capacity, and also it's been very, very neglectful for us to have failed for so long to expand and rebuild our nuclear capacity. All these things were completely foreseeable. We've known for at least 14 years that this situation would arise, and governments have simply done nothing.
Why do you think that is?
Because they're useless. I mean, most politicians in this country don't know anything, don't understand anything, and run with the herd. And they have just not done the things which they ought to.
But there have been politicians that have warned about this. I remember Liam Fox talking to him about this in 2014, where he said, look, energy security is going to be the big issue of our time. And yet he was a siren voice. I don't know how many other people thought.
Look what happened to him. I mean, where is he now? The mainstream politics is constantly obsessed with the short term and with public relations, and has very little interest in doing long-term good.
Peter York.
Well, the hard fact is that the moment Putin threatened energy security across Europe, all the fossil fuel lobbyists saw their opportunity to say, well, of course, we have to think about the future, but then we have to think about the near term, and here is something wonderful, and it would be very irresponsible not to do it. I don't know how wonderful or otherwise it is, but these things aren't quick to put underway. And in our case, they would be tremendously patchy, because part of any clause, even when Liz Truss wanted to reinstate it, it had to be with the permission of the locals. So there wouldn't actually be all that much of it, because people don't like it.
See, I think one of the telling things here is that the main fossil fuel companies haven't got behind fracking. If they thought that there was something in it, they would surely have been investing billions of pounds into
fracking,
it.
and they've got
they're
got big
comparatively
lobbyists.
small fry, aren't they?
Yes, but they've got
compared to Shell or BP.
The richest man in Britain has got some fracking interests. I mean, it's not a totally marginal thing with no power or weight behind it.
Well, it's not going to be on the agenda for the next few years anyway, according to Rishi Sunak. We'll come to more of your questions in a second. 0345 6060 973. It's 8:31 news headlines with, I'm hoping it's Darryl Jackson.
It is. Labour says LGBT football fans shouldn't have to hide themselves at the World Cup in Qatar, a country where homosexuality is illegal. That's after the Foreign Secretary James Cleverly was criticised for telling LBC people needed to be respectful if they're attending. Sir Keir Starmer says the new Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, has done a grubby deal by reappointing Suella Braverman as Home Secretary. She resigned from the role only 6 days ago because of a security breach. She sent an official document using her personal email. And campaigners have welcomed Rishi Sunak's decision to reimpose the fracking ban in England. His predecessor, Liz Truss, lifted the argument, saying it would strengthen the country's energy supplies. LBC weather dry for most tonight. Some showers in the northwest and southern areas with a low of 9 degrees.
This is LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
8:36 on LBC. We have with us Peter York, social commentator, Peter Hitchens, columnist for The Mail on Sunday, Joe Gideon, Conservative MP for Stoke-on-Trent, and James Schneider, co-founder of Momentum and also the author of this book, Our Block, How We Win. Now, you can listen to James and I talking about this for nearly an hour, was it an hour, 3/4 hour, something like that, on my book club podcast. But just give us a flavour of what the book's all about.
The book is trying to lift the left up from the defeatism that we got after getting a bit of a whacking in the 2019 election, to say that...
Which, of course, was all your fault.
Which, of course, was all my fault, yes. To say that there's actually lots of progressive common sense in the country. People want broadly taxing the rich, public ownership, more money for public services, higher wages, all those sorts of things that are trade unions and social movements, Extinction Rebellion, Black Lives Matter, all of these things are all more powerful than they were beforehand. So what we need to do is bring together the different left movements, the social movements, the trade unions, with the left that remains in the Labour Party and maybe in a few other places, and bring those together and put forward a powerful case for how we can make the country better, and then a political opening will come down the line.
Peter Hitchens, what do you make of all of that?
Well, I think it might, alas, in the coming years, pick up quite a following, because we're going to be in a state of endless crisis where everybody's standard of living is falling and taxes are rising and public services are deteriorating and unemployment is increasing and all kinds of other things, such as general disorder and levels of crime are worse. So at that time, people who are offering programs of this kind immediately come to the fore rather more than they do in normal times. Some of the things that you say are perfectly sensible. I want to renationalise the railways like anything. I'm not in favour of unfair taxation, and a lot of other things I would do which we would probably agree on, but some of the other things, particularly the mention of Extinction Rebellion, make me worry slightly about where all this would end up. And I don't necessarily think that you've had it. The other thing is, I think that there will almost certainly be major constitutional reform after the next election, which will make the left more powerful.
Right, well, let's move on to another question. It's a text question from Harry in Sutton. Iain, please ask Peter Hitchens, brackets, and the rest of the panel about Germany opting to make recreational cannabis legal. Should the UK take similar steps? Could be a good earner for the Treasury. I think it's not a secret, Peter, that you would not be in favour of this.
Well, no, but the thing is that in this country, the marijuana has been more or less decriminalised anyway, really since the 1990s. The step of legalisation, which has now taken place in several states in the United States and in Canada, takes it to the stage where commercial companies, very similar to big tobacco, which we've all spent 50 years trying to defeat, will be marketing and advertising openly and without legal restriction a dangerous poison which will do terrible damage to its users. And if anybody doubts this, then stick around. It's the most certain one-way ticket to the third world anybody could possibly embrace. I don't know why, given the huge amounts of evidence now available, that the correlation between marijuana use and mental illness is extraordinarily strong. Why anybody would risk legalising and having the advertising and open sale of something. We've spent, as I say, half a century clubbing the tobacco industry into submission and getting people to stop smoking. A terribly dangerous thing where the government indeed made an awful lot of money out of human misery, and so did commercial firms. Why would we want to do it all over again with something which is in many ways even worse? Lung cancer is terrible, but lifelong mental illness is also tragic and catastrophic, both for the individual who suffers it and, of course, for his or her family. And it's extraordinary how unwilling people are to listen to this evidence. They only need to ask Professor Sir Robin Murray, one of the most distinguished psychiatrists in the country, and he will tell them. But you constantly get people saying, "Oh, we're doing science-based research and all our efforts are fact-based," and they don't even know about this, or they choose not to know. Also, legalisation has been a failure on its own terms, particularly in Canada. The idea that legalisation would lead to regulation of strengths and controls over sales was always rubbish, because legalisation means taxation, and taxation means that the illegal gangs still continue to function. So any attempts to do all those things which were claimed failed because the illegal market simply mopped up the demand which the legal market wasn't allowed to meet. But none of it works. It's all bilge, but it has an immensely powerful and very, very rich lobby behind it, so it continues to sweep all before it.
Do you appreciate that I didn't interrupt you there?
I appreciate it immensely.
Peter York.
Well, mature people think fondly, quite a lot of them, about cannabis as it used to be. There's been a step change in what people consume, the power and consequently the danger. You'll be very much aware of that, Peter, which means that there are a lot of people who don't know where they are in this argument because they've got those fond, old-fashioned feelings because it was regarded as an entry-level drug for hippies. For middle-class hippies, they'll get over it.
Whereas, you're talking from personal experience.
Whereas skunk can absolutely ruin lives.
And that's a fair point, isn't it? Because there are varying degrees. I mean, we use this catch-all term cannabis. There are varying degrees of it, and some US states have decriminalised it or regulated it. But it's a very sort of soft version.
But the regulation doesn't work because even if the legal outlets sell at restricted strengths, the illegal outlets which continue to operate almost totally unrestrained by law enforcement will supply the higher strength, which is what actually drug users tend to want. So whatever the answer is to higher strength marijuana, it's not legalization.
Joe?
So I agree with the last two speakers. It's a scourge. Stoke-on-Trent has a real problem with both a drug culture and county lines, and by legalising an element of the drugs, I agree entirely with what Peter said. The sort of hardcore skunk end of marijuana will still be in that illegal space, and we have to tackle the criminal gangs, and we have to be harder on drugs, not softer, in my opinion.
But the war on drugs has been fought for decades and hasn't been won. Do you think it genuinely can ever be won? Or Peter would argue that the war has actually never been fought, I guess.
I would argue that. But I would say that in the places where drug abuse and possession has been fought by law, particularly in Japan and South Korea, it's been fought very successfully. And in both those countries, the use of marijuana is much, much lower than here, and it's still viewed with considerable social horror.
Isn't that partly a cultural thing?
No, it's not.
I mean, can you really compare Japan and South Korea with Western Europe?
Absolutely, because they are civilized, law-governed, advanced countries, and what they do is pretty much what this country did until about 1967, and it was successful here then too. I think it's ever so slightly racialist, isn't it, to say that these Asian countries are so culturally different to us. I don't know what the word is intended to convey about Japan and South Korea. These are highly advanced, say, law-governed democracies. This isn't those countries which have the death penalty for drug possession. These are countries which use the law in a proportionate way against the drug, and they do it successfully. Okay. And there is no difference between their culture, except they've got more sense about drugs than we have.
James, as the youngest member of this panel by quite a stretch, I think, do you think your generation has a rather different view to this than older generations? And
yes,
it's always been the case in a way.
Well, I don't know if that's always been the case, but I think it is that, and I think mainly because that's based in facts. So Portugal has decriminalised drug, not just cannabis, but pretty much all drugs, and both drug-related deaths have decreased and actual use of drugs has decreased. So I think that there is very clearly a case for treating drug abuse as a health issue and not as a criminal issue, and to decriminalise, to regulate. And I agree with Peter about the danger of potentially having big corporations that are trying to push drugs. I think that should not be allowed. But I think clearly there are mental health issues, there are wider health issues. They should be treated as that. They shouldn't be treated through the courts. They shouldn't be treated as a criminal issue.
But Peter, there is a clear trend now to decriminalisation or legalisation. Do you have any hope that from your point of view, that trend can be reversed.
Well, I have to hope, because it would be such a disaster if it wins, but it's not so much a clear trend as a clear wave of money. There's an enormous amount of greed in this, and what's astonishing is people who loathe the fast food chains and the soft drinks companies and the people who mess up the planet in all kinds of ways give support to one of the nastiest greed lobbies I think I've ever seen in my life, and a very, very rich one. You look at what happened in California with Proposition 64, it was a billionaire campaign, and these are very, very rich people hoping to become richer, and they will become richer. And there are also cynics in politics who think, oh yes, this is a great opportunity for another sin tax, because taxes on pleasures are extremely reliable in hard times and bring in a lot of money. Well, okay, in that case, why not legalise and tax prostitution as well? We've gone far too far as it is on gambling, which is something which
I'd be all in
disgracefully lax on. Well, okay, but there ought to be enough morality in politics to tell you that you don't make money out of human misery, and human misery is what will result on a very large scale from the legalisation of marijuana in every country which adopts it. It's bad enough with decriminalisation. That ought to be reversed. But if you go on to legalisation, then it will become irreversible. This is the problem. Irreversible. What about alcohol? Alcohol is a disaster. Everybody knows this. If alcohol were being introduced now and we knew what it was like as we do, we wouldn't let it be legal. But it's there now. It's irreversible. It's in mass use. Even the Iranian Islamic Republic can't stop alcohol, so I don't imagine we could. But the idea that that is an argument for having another dangerous poison released into the midst of us seems to me to be very, very...
Thank you very much. We will take more of your calls in just a moment. It's 8:47.
LBC. Nick Ferrari at breakfast. Back tomorrow morning from 7. Listen on your radio and on Global Player.
Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer, if England got to the World Cup final in Qatar, would you go?
No, the human rights record is such that I wouldn't go, and that'll be the position of the Labour Party.
James Cleverly, Foreign Secretary. Sir Keir Starmer told me earlier this week he won't be going. Are you?
Well, it is an important international event. I think if I am able to go, I should go.
But do you not send more of a message in the way Sir Keir has said that he will not go, even if England get to the World Cup final?
Well, as leader of the opposition, he's in a lovely position to send messages. I've got real work to do.
Nick Ferrari at breakfast.
With Motorway, where dealers compete to give you their best price for your car.
LBC. problems. Leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale. Tweet at LBC.
It's 8:52 on LBC. With us are Joe Gideon, Conservative MP, James Schneider, author of the book Our Block, How We Win, Peter Hitchens, columnist for the Mail on Sunday, and Peter York, who informs me that he's president of the Media Society. What is the Media Society? I feel I should know about it.
Puts on things like this to talk about media subjects exclusively.
Excellent. Well, you can invite me to chair one of them.
Yes.
And co-author of The War Against the BBC with Paddy Barwise. Is there a war against the BBC?
Yes.
Led by Peter Hitchens.
Indeed. I'm Field Marshal in that war.
Particularly by your newspaper and similar newspapers, what we call SMET. SMET. It's like Smersh, isn't it? Sun, Mail, Express and Telegraph.
Okay.
They are united in their common loathing of the BBC and do BBC bashing things about 3 times a week.
Why would anybody want to do that? I mean, it's so fair and it's so culturally elevated and it takes its responsibilities towards the country so seriously. Why would anybody want to be critical of it? And it's also so sensitive to complaints.
Because the people in question don't care whether it's fair or not. They're opposed to it ideologically because they're opposed to public service.
On the contrary, my specific point is I want another public service broadcaster to be put in its place.
But
I don't
Peter,
want to privatise. I know I am. It's true, and it's nice of you to say so. But nonetheless, there is a perfectly good argument for sacking the BBC and replacing it with another public service broadcaster, which is not so completely full of people who will not abide by the.
Would it be called GB News?
Amazing. I don't know what you call it, but the amazing thing about the BBC is that they are given this huge amount of money, which is extracted.
How much?
Extracted $5 billion a year.
It's not.
Extracted.
You're absolutely wrong.
Okay, all right. We'll argue about that later.
What
is the price of the licence fee? They're given it in return for making a promise to be impartial, and they don't keep it, and they haven't kept it for years, and nothing happens to the fact that they get this money, which is extracted from you under the threat of imprisonment.
Which I did think would happen before this. But anyway, let's go to Terry in Watford. Hello, Terry. Rescue me.
Ian.
Hello.
Right. My question to the panel is what did James Cleverly mean when he said LGBT plus fans should show a little bit of flex and compromise at the World Cup, and was he right? Can I just say I hope Peter Tatchell got home safely. What he's done for our community over the years is wonderful. Just so you get a steer on where I'm coming from, and maybe I'll call you back after 9 and tell you exactly what I think.
Well, feel free, because we are going to be talking about this after 9 for the whole hour. Now, here's what James Cleverly, the Foreign Secretary, said to Nick Ferrari this morning.
One of the things I would say to the football fans is, please do be respectful of the host nation. They are trying to ensure that people can be themselves and enjoy the football. And I think with a little bit of flex and compromise at both ends, it can be a safe, secure and exciting World Cup.
A little bit of flex and compromise on both sides. Now, obviously, the anti-gay laws in Qatar we know are fairly restrictive, and you can be arrested for showing any sign of public affection. James Schneider, let's come to you first on this.
No, he shouldn't have said it. I mean, I think he was trying to say something about being culturally sensitive when you go to other countries. That's the fine principle, but he's saying that gay people should compromise with laws that don't allow them to be gay, which they shouldn't do. He could have said the same kind of point in a way that it isn't putting the onus on gay football fans going to Qatar. So he's basically just put his foot in his mouth.
I mean, I think essentially what he was saying is, please don't hold hands in the street. I mean, that would be seen as a sort of provocative action, which
I don't think it's the role of the British government to tell its citizens to not hold hands in.
But isn't it the role of the British government to say that you should respect the law of the country that you're visiting, just as we would expect people to respect our laws?
Sure. Firstly, you can hold hands in the street in Qatar. I mean, many people do, who aren't necessarily gay. But I don't think it seems like you're singling out gay British people to say you need to act in a very different way and everything will be okay. It's saying that it's on them. And, the World Cup shouldn't be in Qatar in the first place. It's absurd. They've never qualified for the World Cup. They barely play football. It has to be held in the winter because it's so hot there. Lots of money has gone into it. It's a very peculiar situation. And I think to sort of put the onus on gay people for how they behave is the wrong thing to do. Of course, people should be respectful to other cultures wherever they go, obviously.
I'm conscious of the time. We've nearly run out of it. But Joe Gideon, do you think that James Cleverly should be going to the World Cup as Foreign Secretary? He says he is going to.
So, I agree with you. I think it's about being respectful. I lived in Saudi Arabia for 2 years, and I couldn't drive, and I wouldn't have dreamt of sort of wearing short sleeves and that sort of thing. It's about respect for the culture. I think that it wouldn't have been my choice of the place to hold the World Cup, but ultimately that's outside all our control. I do think we are in there. We've qualified, and as such, I think it's right for the UK government to have representation there.
Peter.
Well, people get into a respect mode when there's a lot of money around and start saying we must be respectful of these people and their culture. When there isn't any money, people are considerably less respectful about the culture of poor places which might have nasty legislation. Mr. Cleverly should get out more, and the fact is he does get his job to get out a lot, but he should get out more. What does he think gay football fans are like? Does he think they've got RuPaul wigs on and they kiss and cuddle in public? What about gay football fans in England? They're not like that. And even if they were, they've learnt not to be.
I'll tell you what, I would like to see the Qatari authorities take on the West Ham gay football fans who are called Pride of Irons. Get it? Peter Hitchens.
Well, I just have to say I give thanks to Divine Providence every day that I don't have to be a spokesman for James Cleverly.
Is that it?
That's it.
Well, amazing. Just to say that lots of ministerial appointments. Joe, your name doesn't feature on the list so far, but two of the female politicians that I've had on the programme over the past 48 hours, Lucy Fraser and Helen Whately, do. Lucy Fraser is now Minister of State at the Department for Levelling Up, Housing and Communities. Why don't they change the title of that ridiculous department? Helen Whately is Minister of State in the Department of Health and Social Care. So, as Margaret Thatcher would say, just rejoice at that news. Final text question from Sam in Norwich. The Kanye West statue has been removed from Madame Tussauds. Who from the world of politics would you like to see immortalised in wax? Peter York.
Probably Clem Attlee. He probably was and has been boiled down.
Yes.
And I think they should put him back up there because there are lots of lessons to be learnt from that cabinet and what it did and the way it created a consensus that lasted quite a long time amongst very clever people on both sides.
Joe Gideon.
We're not restricted to a British person.
No.
So I would go for Angela Merkel. I've just been reading her biography, and it's fascinating, the journey that she went on. And I think, I'm not going to call her the German Margaret Thatcher, but I think Peter might agree that she deserves a place in history.
Yeah, she
Peter?
does. Yeah. Well, I know. Could we have a group of Extinction Rebellion protesters constructed in wax in Manchester, so people could go and cram cake and pies into their faces?
I'm all in favour of that. James?
Thomas Sankara, the revolutionary leader of Burkina Faso in the 1980s.
Goodness.
I think you're going to have to explain that one a little.
Well, everyone could then learn about him because he was there. He was the leader from 1983 to 1987. He transformed the country, largest increase in agricultural production, lots of policies to support female empowerment, anti-debt. He was killed by the CIA for trying to rally African states together to oppose the debt burden that was put on them. Very good guy.
Well, I would nominate Nadine Dorries, particularly after her media performance last night, which we'd better not go into. Thank you very much to all four of you, Joe Gideon, James Schneider, Peter Hitchens, Peter York. We'll be back with another edition of Cross Question next Monday at 8 o'clock. Well, we're going to continue the discussion about Qatar and James Cleverly and what gay people should be doing in Qatar during the World Cup. We'll be getting your views next. 0345 6060 973. It's 9:02.
on your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom, the Shadow Culture Secretary has told LBC LGBT football fans heading to the World Cup in Qatar shouldn't have to hide who they are. Homosexuality is illegal in the country, and Lucy Powell says the country's human rights record is bad on all fronts. It comes after the Foreign Secretary James Cleverly faced criticism after telling LBC this morning fans should make compromises when they visit for the event. Peter Quinn from Watford LGBT supporters group Proud Hornets told LBC people should be